You lose the lottery on a Tuesday, the same way you've lost it every Tuesday for 8 months straight. 2 numbers out of 6. The app tells you flatly that's worth nothing. Same counter, same flickering light, same rack of gum you never buy. The cashier doesn't even look up anymore. You've become furniture to him. Behind you, a woman gasps. Small, but real. Her scratch-off hit for $200, and she's already texting someone, already glowing, already living inside the 5 minutes where $200 feels like a sign from the universe. You step aside so she can celebrate at the counter, and you feel that petty, specific sting of watching someone else's luck land 2 feet from yours. In the car, you don't turn the key right away. You do the math you never write down. $5 a week, 52 weeks a year, 8 months in, roughly $160 fed into a machine that has given you back nothing. Not enough to hurt. That's what makes it so easy to keep doing. Here's the part you don't know yet, sitting in that parking lot. The bet was never really about the numbers on the ticket. It was about whether you'd keep spending small amounts of money and attention hoping to be chosen, or start spending them on something that didn't need luck to notice you at all. You don't buy a ticket the next week. No resolution, no speech to yourself. You just don't feel like standing in that line again. Instead, on the drive to work, you keep circling something that's been needling you for months. At your job, you lose half your day untangling a scheduling system everyone complains about and nobody fixes. Because fixing it isn't officially anyone's job. You've raised it in 3 meetings. Nobody owns it enough to care. That night, instead of a ticket, you buy a domain name. $4 and change. You don't tell anyone. It doesn't feel like a decision so much as redirecting a habit already running on autopilot, pointing the same $5 somewhere that produces a receipt with your name on it. For months, it's nothing. A folder on your laptop, a notebook full of half-sketches for a tool that fixes the exact problem you deal with every day, built for people exactly like you. You're not quitting your job. You're not telling your partner it's anything more than a thing I'm messing around with. Most nights it's 45 minutes after they've gone to bed. Kitchen table energy, except this table has spreadsheets open instead of a hobby. You show it to one person first, Walt, a guy who ran a small logistics company for 20 years before he sold it, and now fixes lawnmowers and occasionally answers emails from strangers a mutual friend sends his way. Walt looks at your prototype for 4 minutes. Nobody will pay per seat for something this small, he tells you. No warmth wasted on softening it. They'll pay for the outcome, not the software. You go home irritated. 3 days later, you rebuild the entire pricing page, because he was right and you knew it the second he said it. Your first paying customer is Andre, who runs a 6-person crew doing residential HVAC installs. He finds you through a forum post you almost didn't write. He pays $40 a month, $36 after the payment processor takes its cut. You remember that number exactly, because it's the first time money has moved toward you instead of away, and for one absurd evening, $36 feels better than any lottery number ever did. You keep your job. This part isn't cinematic, no dramatic resignation, no clearing out a desk in one triumphant scene. For almost 2 years, you're simply a person with 2 jobs, one that pays the mortgage, one that might, eventually, pay for nothing at all. Word spreads the plain way word spreads. Andre mentions it to another crew lead at a supplier's counter. That guy mentions it to his brother-in-law running a plumbing outfit 2 towns over. No launch, no ad spend. Just people telling other people about a tool that quietly saved them a Sunday night of paperwork. Your partner starts noticing the math before you're ready to explain it. A $300 server bill on a shared card. A late night that becomes a late month. They ask, not unkindly at first, what exactly they're watching you build, and whether it's worth what it's costing. Not just money, but you, showing up tired for the job that actually pays the bills. 14 months in, it almost breaks. You've missed 2 dinners that week. The tool has 40 paying customers, which sounds like a lot until you do the math and realize it adds up to less than a single overtime shift. Your partner sits across from you at the same kitchen table, not angry exactly, just tired in a way that scares you more than anger would. I'm not asking you to stop, they say. I'm asking you to tell me if this is a hobby or a plan, because I can support either one. I can't support not knowing which one it is. You don't have a clean answer. You tell them the truth. You don't know yet either, and the not knowing is the actual job right now. They don't love the answer. They stay anyway. Not because they believe in the outcome, because nobody could yet. Because they're willing to sit in the uncertainty with you instead of demanding a certainty you don't have to give. 2 months after that conversation, an operations manager from a regional facilities company, 60 times the size of Andre's crew, calls you on a Tuesday, which you will later notice and find darkly funny. One of her technicians used to work for a smaller outfit that switched to your tool last year and never let it go. She asks if the software can handle 400 technicians instead of 6. It can't. Not yet. You tell her the truth instead of overselling it, and something about that honesty is apparently rarer than she expected, because she tells you to build it, and she'll be your first enterprise customer. You spend the next 4 months rebuilding the entire backend at night, while still going to your day job every morning like nothing is happening, a skill you've quietly become excellent at by now. When the rebuild ships, the company signs a contract worth more in 1 year than the tool made in its first 2 combined. You read the number on the screen twice. Not life-changing money, but it's the first number that makes the whole thing feel like a business instead of a project you haven't had the heart to abandon. You quit your day job 9 months later, on a Thursday, in an unremarkable meeting with a manager who seems more relieved than surprised. You'd expected the moment to feel enormous. It mostly feels like taking off a coat that's been too tight for a year without you fully registering it. You hire Priya first, a developer who used to work at a company 4 times your size, who takes a pay cut to join you because, she tells you later over cheap pizza in the spare room that's now an office, she wanted to help build something before someone else decided its ceiling for her. Then a second hire, then a 5th, and you're renting an actual office, because the spare room has become genuinely unworkable, stacked with monitors and a whiteboard your partner has started affectionately calling the wall of your other relationship. Year 3 is the closest you come to losing it all. A competitor with more funding and a flashier interface starts poaching your biggest accounts one by one, and then goes after your single largest customer directly. A 200 technician contract that accounts for a third of your revenue. You spend 6 brutal weeks rebuilding features you thought were finished, fueled by a fear that doesn't feel like the wide-open dread of the early days, but something sharper. The fear of losing something you've actually built, instead of the fear of never building anything at all. You sleep in the office twice that month. Priya finds a critical bug at 2 a.m. on a Sunday and fixes it before you've even woken up to see the alert. You keep the customer, barely. You remember that stretch more clearly than almost any of the good months, the way people remember the near miss more vividly than the finish line. By year 5, the company has grown past the point where you can name every customer from memory, which used to feel like the whole point, and now just feels like the natural cost of it working. An investment firm reaches out, not the first to call, but the first whose numbers make you sit very still at your desk. They're not offering to buy the company outright. They're offering a growth round that values the business at just over $400 million, with an option for you to sell a portion of your own shares now, in cash, while keeping control of everything else. You take the call sitting in the same kind of chair you sat in at your old day job, in an office that used to be a spare bedroom's ambitious cousin. There's a half-empty coffee cup on the desk from that morning, gone cold hours ago, and somewhere down the hall you can hear Priya laughing at something on a customer call. The number is read to you in the same flat, professional tone Andre once used to tell you his crew liked the new scheduling feature. You ask them to repeat it, not because you didn't hear it, but because some part of you needs it to land twice before it becomes real. You don't call anyone right away. You sit at your desk the way you once sat in your car outside a gas station, doing math on $160 that felt, at the time, like it mattered. You think about the domain name that cost $4 and change. You think about Walt telling you your pricing was wrong in under 5 minutes. You think about Andre, still a customer, still paying $40 a month, blissfully unaware he was ever your entire business. That night you tell your partner the number at the same kitchen table where all of this started. No folded ticket this time, no receipt to explain away. They don't react to the size of it first. They ask if you're going to sleep now, which makes you laugh for the first time in what feels like a week, because it's such a small, exact question, and somehow it's the only one that actually gets to you. Once a year, out of something between habit and superstition, you still buy a single lottery ticket. You don't tell anyone. You buy it at a different gas station now, nowhere near your old route, mostly because the short drive gives you a few quiet minutes alone. You've lost every time. You've stopped expecting anything else. The ticket isn't really about winning anymore. It's a small, private ritual, a way of touching the version of the story that never happened, the one where the numbers matched and none of the last 5 years needed to exist. You fold this year's losing ticket in half, the same automatic motion your hands learned years ago without meaning to, and you put it in your jacket pocket anyway, the one you never use for anything else. Not because it means something, because some habits outlive the reasons you started them, and this one, unlike the last one, finally cost you nothing you weren't willing to lose.